Hey everyone, and welcome back to Made Possible by Pop Culture, the podcast. This is still season 2. I'm still Danielle Turchiano. And yeah, unfortunately, I am still popping my peas a bit on this microphone. I do apologize, but I honestly don't know when that's going to get better because we're at that part in the intro where I'm going to summarize what it is that I do here so that if you didn't know, now you'll know. Made Possible by Pop Culture is a weekly podcast where I invite guests to come on and share stories from past and present pop culture that has greatly shaped them. I usually have one guest on per episode, but sometimes, typically around the holidays, I'll do special roundtable episodes that feature multiple guests all talking about the same topic. Now, if you listen to the last roundtable, it was for Thanksgiving, and there was a sort of kind of little Easter egg thing in there that teases this episode just a little bit. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you what that is in case you did listen to it and didn't catch it. I mentioned a show that I had watched that wasn't out yet, that I enjoyed a lot, but wished had more murder. Well, that show is out today, and we're back to the format with one special guest. That special guest is that show's creator and showrunner, Liz Feldman. Now, you probably know Liz best from creating and running Dead to Me, Emmy nominated, much talked about, much written about if you followed me at all in my career, because I definitely wrote about it in depth. It was a 3-season Netflix comedy, and she's following it up with another Netflix comedy, dark comedy, called No Good Deed. That just dropped today. So here's your warning. We will talk some spoilers. So if you haven't watched No Good Deed yet, I understand it is still early in the day. Go find Netflix, your password, your friend's password, however you watch it, come back and listen to us talk about it. Okay, well, Liz, thank you for coming on Made Possible by Pop Culture. I have to say, I mean, those of you watching on YouTube, you can kind of see I've come prepared. I always like to dress for the guest. I'm wearing my Friends of Heaven shirt, which is from Dead to Me.
I really appreciate it. What a lovely homage.
Well, I was gonna be like, where's the No Good Deed merch? But maybe too soon.
Give us a second. Give us a second. I mean,
Okay.
the show's just coming out, so
Okay. Well,
we'll get
how
there.
are things in your world being that it's just released?
It's exciting. You work on something for so long. It starts as like this weird notion in your head that turns into an idea. Then it takes your entire brain over for years. And I pitched No Good Deed in September of or maybe October 2021.
Oh wow.
So yeah, it's been a while in the making, and we had a little bit of a strike to contend with. So a little bit of a delay here and there, but it's exciting. I just want to share it with people. I feel like people could really use like a good binge right now, some
Mm-hmm.
escape,
Mm-hmm.
some like, some really sort of engrossing entertainment. And I feel like in part that's what I'm here to do, and I'm happy that I get to give that to people right now.
That's what I want you here to do today.
Okay, great.
And we are going to talk about No Good Deed in more detail when we get to the like present influence portion. But I always like to start chronologically, just works better for my own brain. So I like to start with the influence that my guest has chosen to come on and talk about from their past. And I'm going
Mhm.
to ask you to do what I ask everyone to do, which is I want you to set it up because I feel like it always sounds better when it comes out of the person who's most passionate about it, but also set up not just what you picked, but kind of the where you were in the world when you first
Mm.
encountered it and why it became such an influence on you.
So my choice of influence for today, and listen, I've had many pop culture influences, so this was hard because initially when you asked me, I think I gave
Yeah.
you a list of like 10 different things.
Everybody always does. And I'm always like, that's great, but I want to be able to get specific.
That
So
makes
that's
sense.
why and also honestly, like I like to leave it. If everyone comes on and talks about a lot of different things, we end up having a lot of the same conversations over and over again because inevitably
Absolutely.
there would be the same choice. So,
So today I've chosen to speak about Robert Altman's The Player, which is a movie that came out in 1992 starring Tim Robbins. And when I first saw it, I was 15 years old.
okay.
I don't totally remember if I saw it in the movie theater, but it's likely because that's what we did then. And I don't think that I realized until way more recently how much of an influence that this movie had on me.
Okay.
I was already like really enamored of show business and Hollywood. And I'm from Brooklyn, as are you, I know.
I was going to say, I was going to ask you all about that, about the like at 15, I imagine you already were thinking about this could be my career one day. And you, correct me, went to an art school in Brooklyn or no? I can't
No, I
remember
didn't.
where you went.
I went, well, you and I went to the same elementary school.
Right. But I was at elementary school, you're not necessarily focusing on a track per se, but I feel like when
No, no,
you're
I'm
in high
not
school, you
focusing on
have
a
the
track
option.
yet.
Like when
No,
you,
I'm not.
especially in
Mrs.
that,
Burnett and I were not focusing on a track.
but when you get
By the
to
way,
high
I'm much
school,
older than Danielle. We
you're
did not go to
not.
school at the same time.
You're not
So
much older, but what I was going to say is when you get to the high schools, especially in that neighborhood, and people who have heard my episode with Jack Jokinen, we talked a little bit about like you can test into a magnet school, you can test into an art school, like you can kind of be on a track.
you can. And I was, not to brag, I was in the gifted and talented program in elementary school.
Hmm.
But from there, I went to a school called Poly Prep, which was just like a
Right.
very old, privatey, preppy, conservative school, where they did have a really good arts program, and I was encouraged certainly in that direction at school. But I am a weird person, and I just sort of was born knowing what I wanted to do. And I've always been interested in comedy, and I've always just been really like obsessed with entertainment. And so when I was 10 years old, I asked my parents for an agent for my birthday. And they were like,
Oh,
it doesn't work like that. My parents
well,
are chiropractors.
okay.
So it
I would
wasn't,
say it could work like that
it
if
could,
you were going to be an actor.
it could work that like that if I was a Nepo
No,
gal.
no. So we both went to, I don't know if you want me to name the school we went to, but we went to the same elementary school. And when I was in fifth grade there, I was like a classroom assistant for a first grade class. I don't know if they had this when you were
Mm,
there, but you
mm-mm.
basically like were their monitor at lunch. And I
Okay.
used to have to help one of the little kids sign out because she was going on auditions. And she actually auditioned
Oh,
for Demi Moore's daughter in, oh, what was that stripper movie?
yes, I know
I was
exactly.
about to say Showgirls, which is not it, but whatever. So what I'm saying is you could have had an agent.
Yes, I mean, we were living in New York City. It wasn't like a totally far-fetched thing. We just had zero connections, to the business. And so the deal that I made with my parents at the time was when I got old enough, when I was old enough to take the subway by myself, I could go on auditions, but I had to do everything myself. Like they
Mm.
weren't going to, be stage parents or anything like that. They were busy professionals. So that's what I did. And that's sort of how I started in this business. So already by 15, I was like auditioning for commercials, and I had an agent, and that kind of stuff, that I procured. Who the hell knows how? Somehow through like Backstage Magazine. All I know is
Mhm.
Backstage Magazine is the reason why I started my career. So I saw this movie, The Player, and I just never seen anything like it. And it felt like such an insider's perspective
Yeah,
on Hollywood. It just felt so authentic, while at the same time and of course, I'm telling you this as the adult me, not the 15-year-old me.
right.
But it just was like, it just was sickeningly enough. I was like, I want to live in that world.
I don't know if it's sickening because you just said as the adult you like you have a different perspective now on some of the things you might call sickening from the movie.
Fair. Yes.
I saw it when I was young too, and I had the same feeling of like, I want to work in Hollywood, so I want to see all of these projects about Hollywood because while, yes, it's satirical, there's truth underneath it. And so I want to know what
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting into kind of feeling.
Yep.
And so I didn't love every piece of it when I first saw it because there were some things that I was already like, oh, I would never want a boss like that, right? But at the same
Right.
time, just to be able to see something where it's like, oh, that's how it works, to feel like
Exactly.
I have an understanding. I know what I need to do to be a part of who that
Exactly.
group is.
And just that opening tracking shot that's like 8 minutes long, and it's one take, just that world that it sets up, I was like, that I want to go to there. Like,
Mhm.
and I didn't know yet at the time that I was going to be a writer per se, but it's interesting looking back on it because it is so much about writers. It's so written from the perspective of a writer clawing their way into this business and trying to stay. And the tone is so unique, and
Mm,
especially for the time. And I hadn't really been exposed to a lot of Robert Altman's work at that point, so I wasn't familiar. But when I look back, I mean, I recently was watching the movie, so, to be more prepared for this conversation. And I thought, wow, I have been really influenced by this. And it was very subconscious.
it's interesting that you said that because I rewatched it also for this, and I was like, I wonder if intentionally you saw a movie like this and started to realize like, oh, the darker comedy. I like playing with murders. I like, just those elements of it is something that maybe you said at one point, like, I'm acknowledging I like what he did here. I want to do that too.
And truly, I'm going to say it's 95% subconscious, because I hadn't seen this movie in probably over 20 years before, I created Dead to Me.
Okay.
And, but it's definitely a hugely influential movie for me. And it's one of those, when people ask me, what are your top five favorites? It's always in there. So, yes, clearly it had a massive impression on my psyche, but also just on my little formative creative person. And my first like memory of thinking of this darker kind of subversion of
Hmm.
uh society and expectation, I was probably in my 20s when I had my first idea of that, but I was so firmly in the comedy world. I was like, what the hell am I going to do with an idea like this? And it definitely was an idea that, now that I think about it, was influenced a lot by The Player.
Hmm.
And I remember thinking like, God, I guess I really like sort of, something that has a mystery element, but like, why aren't they ever funny? And I
Okay.
was thinking more sort of in television, because I don't, for some reason, I mean, like I would love to, get into films and filmmaking, but I'm television is my first love. And, I've just always wanted to work in this medium. And so I've been like percolating and simmering on this thought of like, why do comedies have to just be one thing?
Mhm.
And then I think after 10 years of being in multicam sitcom world, which is awesome. And by the way, such a great way to learn how to work efficiently and, you know, um, quickly and cleverly, but it's limited, and
Yes, it's a
so
specific thing.
it's a specific thing. So this is a very long answer to say that I chose Robert Altman's The Player because only now, 35 years later, do I realize what a huge influence it has
Mhm.
really had on me as an artist.
And you referenced Tim Robbins as being like the star of the movie. Who I feel like watching this movie, and I don't know if I noticed it the first time, it is just such a who's who
It
of
is chock
Hollywood.
full.
Yeah, like of the time, but also of people who have had careers this whole time. Like
Yes,
just
I mean, like, you could watch this movie today and be like, and you'll probably recognize 75% of the cameos.
yes, exactly.
Yes.
Like the people who play themselves versus the people who played actual roles, etc. Has that, I mean, I know you said it wasn't like you were watching this all the time, but I am curious about, as you watched it more than once, even if just recently,
Mm-hmm.
if that has affected anything, if the characters or even the actors that you're watching are different than on your first watch, how you're taking it in this time.
Right now, I'm watching it also as a producer and going,
Mm,
holy shit, they got a lot of, how did they get all of these actors to agree to make cameos and maybe say one line or maybe say none?
mm,
I mean, like, Jack Lemmon is just sitting at a party playing the piano.
right.
Harry Belafonte has one line, I think. I mean, these like luminaries,
Hmm.
um, Burt Reynolds has a great little cameo. Angelica Houston, John Cusack. I mean,
Hmm.
the list goes. Cher, I think,
Yeah.
like walks into a party, and it's like as if she's just a background artist,
Hmm.
And I think I obviously was tickled by that at the time, but I don't think I even really understood how stacked the cameo cast was like until more recent viewings.
Let me maybe reverse the question in the sense of
Okay.
like the first time you're watching this movie and you know you want to come to Hollywood and you see all of these Hollywood players in this movie, and in a way, you see them at very real Hollywood locations.
Mm-hmm.
Was that like a roadmap for you when you were like, well, when I go out to LA, I'm going to visit all those places so I can run into those people? Like, how seriously did you take the reality of this movie?
That's a great question. No, I think some of that has been subconscious for me too. I don't think I clocked like, oh, that's the Sony lot,
Hmm.
and that must be a real lot on. I don't think I had enough of an understanding of like the geography
Oh, but they
of
like reference Jeffries. Like
right. Like
you
I that
couldn't
was over
Google
my head,
Jeffries back then. So
You
yeah.
exactly. There was like you couldn't these things would you'd be you'd be lucky if you just remembered some of the references. The
Sure.
one thing I always remembered what were the mud baths that they went somewhere around Palm Springs and took mud baths.
Hmm.
And it took me a really long time, but I would say maybe for the first time 7 years ago, maybe I was like already in my 40s, I was in my late 30s. I realized that that was a real place
Hmm.
called Two Bunch Palms. And I went there and my wife and I made my wife, I was like, we're getting mud baths. And she was like, okay. And so we did. We went and we sat in those mud baths. And I was like, I really had a moment.
Nice.
And that's about the only like very specific thing that I did that I know is from that movie.
Okay.
But and also would never do it again because let me tell you, the mud gets everywhere.
Out of all the things to do,
Yeah.
that would not have been in my top 10.
No, not a crack is spared.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's interesting also because you hearing you say like you weren't necessarily thinking about being a writer immediately when you watched this film, obviously
Mm-hmm.
became a writer. So much of this movie, yes, is about writing and about the writer, but it's also about the executives trying to get rid of the writer in,
Uh-huh.
in different ways. Like, obviously, maybe not obviously to anyone who hasn't seen this movie, spoiler alert, like the plot of the movie, the summary of the movie is that Tim Robbins' character is getting threats. And he thinks it's this specific writer that, he kind of blew off and he kills the guy. And then the threats still come.
Accidentally, sort of.
Sort of. I'm
Well,
still
it's not, I wouldn't call it first degree.
I mean, that is only somebody who has done shows about murder could say. Because
This would be second degree murder. Could
okay,
even have been manslaughter because
but
he was
still
not
kills
he
him.
didn't start it.
That's
I don't know
fair.
why I'm defending the executive. Jeez.
You know what? That was kind of where my question was going, just in the sense of like watching the movie as a writer now with everything that has been changing in Hollywood, AI, the strikes, etc. There's a line that Larry Levy, Peter Gallagher says about cutting out the writer and the way he
Mm-hmm.
like goes to the newspaper and is like, just read a headline. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's a movie. We don't even need the writer. Still burns me. Like it burned me when I saw it the first time
Mm-hmm.
and it's worse now. And like, yes, it's satirical, but can we laugh at it now?
I mean, look, I think if anything, upon my most recent watching of this movie, I was like, nothing's changed. But it was weirdly kind of not just validating, but almost kind of like it put me at ease in a weird way because I'm like, oh, it's just always been just a terrible business. I think it's a fantastic pursuit. And I think it's like a worthy artistic calling, but it's a terrible business,
Hmm.
and the business has been very kind to me. So I feel almost like I'm cursing myself saying that, but it is a really rough business. And, shelf life is short
Mhm.
and you're kind of only as good as the last thing you did. And a lot of this stuff is what's sort of explored in that movie. And the same stuff is true today. There's also like massive turnaround with executives today, and the same feeling that I know that these a lot of like really great people that I work with on the executive side are looking over their shoulder and don't feel secure. And it's like if the salaried employee of the company doesn't feel secure, how does the
Right.
writer for hire feel? So um there's a lot of sort of like eerily relevant stuff in that movie, and in a way it was comforting because it's like, oh, it's just cyclical.
Mm,
There we have highs and lows in this business, and you know they're always trying to cut out the middleman if they can and make things for cheaper if they can, but success is usually rewarded, so you just sort of have to hope and work hard enough to try to be on the success side of the story.
okay. I think that's a very healthy attitude and way of
Oh,
viewing
thank you.
it. I watched it when I rewatched it recently. It was in a very, it was after a very long line of me looking at jobs that were all very, you're going to train AI to replace all the people you used to hire. And I was
Oh,
just like,
fuck.
I'm not in a good mood right now. And then I was watching Larry say, we're going to cut out the writer. And I was like, just mad at it. I mean, like, I still think it's a great movie, but I was like in a bad place for it at the time.
Sure.
Um, and so what I did
Understood.
when I did on that watch was I really started focusing on like the mystery element of the story, which is not something
Mm-hmm.
I had done in the previous times. I
Mm-hmm.
had seen it partially because the movie itself kind of tells you to forget it for a little while because
Mm-hmm.
Tim's character's not focusing on it. Um, but there is that really interesting mystery of like who is sending the threats and like what does it really mean? And you kind of have Lyle Lovett as a cop. He's on to Tim's character about the murder, but like we're not really following the investigation. And I'm curious if in your either any viewing, really, like if that part of the storyline spoke to you in any way, like the actual investigation.
Again, I guess it did because I mean, it's truly like a lot. It's funny, like how much inspiration can just be latent, and you don't realize that it's sort of in there and it's brewing, and then it comes out in these interesting ways. I mean, I think it's pretty tertiary, the investigation,
Yeah,
in terms of the story. I think it's to keep that thread alive. But this is really not a movie about a murder.
no.
It's not even a movie about, you know, getting away with murder, really. And it is a satire, in part, but it's I mean, it's just sort of a brilliant inside out look at Hollywood. And I think if anything, it probably gave me license
Mm.
to write stories that are about more than one thing.
Hmm.
And that even if there's a crime and an investigation that follows, it doesn't have to be a procedural. We don't have to then lean on the investigation,
Yep.
which is quite dry usually. And by the way, time and place for everything. I love a good Law and Order. I love a good procedural. They're very comforting. You know they're going to solve the crime at the end.
Right.
But the way in which the player blends genre was really quite revolutionary for the time, and clearly made an indelible impression on me.
So, what do you remember from your first viewing as being a standout scene that stuck with you? That stuck with you maybe more consciously.
I mean, I remember the first tracking shot because I think that was in some ways my first time being on a studio lot,
Mm.
and it's where I
Yeah.
wanted to be. So that really did stick out to me. And his sort of voyeuristic, almost his Hitchcockian or sort of noir um stalking of um I'm gonna totally slaughter her name. Greta, her
Oh,
last name is the his love interest, not Cynthia Nixon. Not Cynthia,
no.
not sorry, not
June. I
Cynthia.
mean, her name is June. So that's why I was like, what name are you going to slaughter? Because June
But
is,
her the actress's name. Greta Scacchi, Scott, you know what I'm saying?
yes,
Sachi. I
yes,
think
yes.
you don't pronounce the first.
I'm not,
So
I,
Greta,
that I'm not
he's
sure. I thought we were just going with character, but okay.
okay with June Goodman's daughter. And I just remember the eeriness, but the kind of like it was sort of sexy the way that they shot him voyeuristically watching her and her not being aware that she's being watched. And like it's such a fucked up sort of meet cute.
Yeah, that's not how I read that scene at all. I mean, that's how they
Oh,
wanted you to read it. but I had seen Scream first because I saw this
Oh,
movie years after it came out. And so I was like, oh, he's gonna murder her. And then he obviously didn't, but it gave me those vibes of like serial killers outside the house. Like we know this guy is unhinged. I would
yeah,
not have used the words meet cute, but then given where the relationship went, I was like, clearly
exactly.
that's what they wanted.
Yes, I don't think you're supposed to think that either. I think you're supposed to be uneasy. Just the whole way
Mm,
it's shot, it makes you uncomfortable. But
mm.
I do remember the way that it was shot, and it just was so provocative at the time, and still. And I just remember her character and just like her, she was a pretty unique character for that time too, in that she was not married to the screenwriter
Yeah.
who played by Vincent D'Onofrio, Kahane, and and she's pretty like she just sort of asserts her independence right away. I don't know. I just remember her character a lot from that time, and I liked that. And I remember the mud baths.
Obviously. I mean, obviously that was more influential slash formative than I wouldn't have assumed. But yeah,
We all have our own takeaways. And
that's
that's
true.
why I love making television, because it's amazing. People will watch and they'll take something away, and I'll be like, I didn't even mean that, but that's great.
That
Glad you
happens
read
to me a
into it.
lot. Yeah, I read a lot into it. I will say it's very brief, but like early in the film when they are sitting down, it's right after Tim's character sees Angelica and John and goes over and says hello. And I
Mm-hmm.
already am having these feelings of like, they don't know who you are. They don't care. Like, this is a very Hollywood
It's
moment.
so good.
He
Yes.
sits down at his table and he's like, can we talk about something other than Hollywood for a
Mm-hmm.
change? And
Mm-hmm.
that has stuck with me for years because every time I go to any Hollywood event, I try desperately to like pivot a conversation just to see what will happen. And it always just rubber bands right back. And I'm like, and
Yep.
there's some people that I've become close enough, we're friends enough with that like we'll get a couple minutes of like, how are your kids? How is your family?
Uh-huh.
Always goes right back. And I'm just like, oh, this industry.
Yep. I
Mm.
think, and to finish the scene, he says, can we just talk about anything other than Hollywood for a minute? And then there's about like 3 seconds of silence. And then they all just laugh because they can't.
Right.
They
Right.
can't.
I mean, I don't know if it's the same scene, but there's one scene where they make a joke about like, well, we're educated people. We should be able to do something. And that also makes
It is the
me laugh.
same
It
scene.
is? Okay. Or like
Yes.
that makes
Yes.
me laugh because I'm like, are you? Because I don't think a lot of the people I encounter are. So
No
anyway.
comment.
Okay, so I've brought it up. You've referenced it a few times, just like unintentional inspiration, maybe inspiration is
Mm-hmm.
the wrong word, but like unintentionally influential throughout the years. I pointed out like it is very reductive, but like the murder and the type of humor, I can see how maybe that would shape some of
Mm-hmm.
the things that you've done more recently. I also want to talk about endings. I want to talk about
Mm-hmm.
it specifically with the player because they do kind of have that little epilogue of like not only are they showing you what the movie they've been making this whole time becomes, but they do eventually solve that who is the harasser, who is
Mm-hmm.
sending him those postcards, and what does that mean? And to me, that kind of does wrap the movie up
Mm-hmm.
it in like a little bit of a bow. But you're really good at a cliffhanger. So I'm almost curious if when you see movies like that, when you were younger or even today, like if there's any part of you that's like anti, like I want to make sure I don't do that. I want to leave a little something because these characters are living on.
I think part of that speaks to a little bit of the difference between genres of or the medium of television and film.
Yeah.
So much of what I do, especially on Netflix, because that's just currently where I get to make TV. I know that things need to have a cliffhanger. I know you need to be projected, into the next episode. It has to be energetically propulsive. And I, by the way, really like writing that way. It's really fun. So, there's so much conversation internally that
Hmm.
happens about these endings, not just like, per episode, but also for the season
Well, right, yeah. I would argue even series because like at the end
and
of Dead to
series.
Me, like to me, the way that you leave Jen at the end of Dead to Me, like depending on what you're projecting as a viewer, that could be a dark ending of like she's telling him this secret. Maybe it's because she doesn't feel like she's ready for him to like fully love her. Now
Mm-hmm.
that's my own projection because I'm a dark person.
Love
But
it.
like that's what I mean. Like you left it in this place of like it seems nice, but also there's this thing hanging over here.
Well, I think, especially with Dead to Me, I wanted to stay true to the storytelling style and the tone all the way through.
Yeah.
And I think to have made that a more definitive ending that put the period on the end of the sentence would just not have felt authentic to
Hmm.
the show. And not to be like pretentious, but when you're doing a show, especially a show that lives for multiple seasons, like it kind of takes on its own form, its own it has its own soul, if you
Yeah.
will. And I really felt intrinsically that the soul of Dead to Me was in the uncomfortable inevitabilities,
Yeah.
if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah.
But it's, there's something built into the fact that everything ends on a cliffhanger that made it so that it had to end on a cliffhanger. And
Yeah.
it just would have felt cheap to do it any other way.
I mean, I agree with you, but I think a lot of writers would have still done it, even if it felt cheap. It's like I'm wrapping the show up, like I'm putting the period on the end of the sentence. And, if you want to come back to me in 5 years and talk about a revival, okay. But right now, and so that's kind of why I was thinking in those terms of like where it comes from. And I guess it also, I mean, it's a matter of taste, but I think it's also a matter of, as you said, like you have to be willing to fully commit to where you're playing. Like what genre, what tone, what playground is this? And if you're not ready to
Exactly.
fully commit to it, then like why are you doing it? Oh, you
Yeah.
didn't say that. I'm saying that. But
Well, I mean, I can tell you why, because it's often it feels very much like there's multiple cooks in the kitchen.
mhm,
We at our very best, we're allowed to create as we see fit, and we can tell stories as they, you know, manifest in our heads, and then we can put them right down on the paper. But there's more to it than that.
yeah.
I have people to answer to, and those people have jobs and lives, and their jobs are to make sure that the story is understandable and marketable and all the abuls. And inevitably it will come down to a subjective take. Some people like a period at the end of the
Right.
sentence. Some people want a happy ending. I knew that I didn't want to totally, I didn't want to drive them off a cliff, Thelma and Louise style.
Sure.
But I also knew that it would have felt wrong to just make everything okay, because wrongs had been done, mistakes had been made, people had been murdered. And it just felt like, in order for Jen to really achieve a whole happy ending, she needs to have the conversation that she's about to have as the show ends. And I would much rather leave an audience filling in the blanks, talking about what that was, questioning
Right.
what would have happened next. I want to leave the audience with the show still alive in their imaginations.
Yeah.
And I think for me, the best way to do that is to not answer every question. It's not to fill in those blanks. It's to have the audience participate in the storytelling.
Yeah. Which kind of turns me to no good deed to a degree. I mean, we're not going to talk about the ending quite yet because, like, we have to talk about the show in general, but I do kind of see that same philosophy. I mean, granted, it's just season one, so it's also a little bit of like we want to get a season two. But to me, the show is so much about secrets, and obviously there are different secrets at the end than in the beginning. You mentioned when we started chatting that this has been kind of in the works longer than I realized, since 2021. So, I mean, this is a little bit of a basic question, but I mean, I am curious if you could walk me through like what was the influential thing that was saying, this is my next show. Like, this is the follow up to Dead to Me in spirit, in tone, but also like in my heart, like the thing that I really want to do next.
So, we made Dead to Me throughout the pandemic. And that's why I pitched this in 2021, because we were shut down at that
Mhm.
time. We also went through a lot of personal
Yeah.
challenges and real difficulties, finishing the last season of Dead to Me. And so we were on a pause for 3 months, and I can't be idle. It's not good for me. And I love coming up with ideas for show. I'm like, it's like my resting brain, you know, added. I don't know. I just can't sort of help myself
Yeah.
truly. I'm like a little obsessive. So I, so during the pandemic, when we were even just waiting to shoot the show, we were literally locked down in our homes, right? Like we're not allowed to leave our houses. And suddenly this place where we lived took on so much more meaning
Mm,
than just this place where we lived. It was literally the only place we were safe.
mm.
And it was not just our home, it was our workplace and our social place and our everything. And I just started to really think about what home really meant. And then at night, I would sort of doom surf on Zillow because I just wanted to go somewhere else. I'm a really social being, and I have a lot of energy, and like being locked down into my little tiny house was because I lived in like a small little bungalow. My wife and I didn't have an office. It was a
Okay.
small little house, and it was a lot. It was really claustrophobic. So I would really just look at listings of other houses just to go to another house, just to
No,
see somewhere else.
I'm only laughing because like that sounds very reasonable, but I'm like 3 steps ahead and I'm like, but you made a show ultimately about a house where it's not really safe for them anymore because their son died in it. And so like to go from my home is safe, but I'm looking at other people's homes,
Well, spoiler alert, but
it's out. People should I told everyone at the start of this, watch it first and come back.
thank you. Okay, good. So sure. Okay, so I'm just thinking in terms of like a palette. I'm just
Okay.
thinking of like what's this a world that I'm interested in, and I was really obsessed with real estate at the time, and so much so that my wife Rachel and I were like, we need to move. We have to, I was like, I have to get the fuck out of here. It's just something to do, right? It's something that could like make us actually get to go see another environment. So
Mhm.
we saw over 50 houses during the pandemic, and it was such a
That,
heightened
that's too
time.
many.
I know it was crazy, but it was such a high stakes time to have to walk into another
That's
person's
also
home.
why it's too many. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and every time we walked into a new house, like you could just feel that there was a story there. There was, people had lived their lives and they had raised their children and they had had fights and they had lost people. And you could just feel all of that. And almost always we would go into a house and the house would just have some like one really weird thing about it. And I just started thinking like, God, like every house is like its own, is as complicated and layered as a human being. And one house we went into, and this is true, and my heart really goes out to the people who were selling because it was a beautiful home. They had just redone it. It was impeccable and clearly not like redone for a flip. Like it
Mm.
was like redone, like they wanted to live there, but they were selling it. And I said, "What? Why are they selling it?" And the real estate agent said, "Because um, she works for the Philharmonic. She's a musician,
Oh, wow.
but she hasn't been able to work in a year and a half or
Oh.
something at that point, and so they have to sell. They can't afford the mortgage." And it's just like it just broke my heart, and it really stayed with me as just a jumping off point. And so, my huge shout out to, I don't know who that person is, but thank you for the inspiration. And, when we finally did find the house that I'm now sitting in, it was crazy to me how insanely stressful it was.
Mm.
I mean, like there are such high stakes involved in the buying and selling of a house. It is literally every dollar you have ever made. It's
Mm.
everything you have worked for. And you're basically in an arranged marriage where you go see this thing once, you spend 10 minutes with it, and then you're like, I'm going to give it everything I've ever made, And so I just was like, this is interesting that it hasn't necessarily been explored in the narrative
Mhm.
form. You know, people love real estate shows that are reality,
Right.
reality shows, but I hadn't, I couldn't think of a show that was like this that had actually explored, more fictional stories.
Right. The reality shows, even we are kind of watching them for the houses, but like really by season three, you're not even really in the houses much. You're following.
Exactly. It's all about the drama. It's like a
Yeah, and
workplace
like that's what this
thing.
show is too. Like, yeah, we start with this beautiful house and everyone's coming to this open house to look at it because they want to buy it because this couple is selling it and they don't really know why. But then when you're spending all of the time with all individual couples learning like what's your deal? You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's where the real meat of the story is and just how they interweave in unexpected ways. Um, I don't want to cut you off. Continue your
No,
story.
no, no. I mean, so the point is, I just was like, there is something here. There's something. There is a show in the buying and selling of a house and the people who are trying to buy it, because also the market in Los Angeles is insane. It's
Yeah.
really, really competitive. When we were selling our tiny little bungalow, 13 offers came in.
Ooh.
When we were buying this house, there were multiple offers. There was an offer that is called an escalate. With an escalation clause, which I didn't even get into in this season of No Good Deed. But basically, the offer, whoever was trying to buy this house, other than us, wanted it so badly that they were like, "We will pay whatever
Oh.
the highest bid is plus whatever it was, $50,000."
I'm gonna say it's impressive that they didn't get it.
So then this guy, pointing at myself, I was like, I gotta get this house. I just knew it. We had seen so many, and I was like, this is our house. So I wrote a letter and I did every possible thing I could do to worm my way into the hearts and brains of the people who lived here. And I like happened to know people who lived across the street, and they put in a good word for us. And I wrote a letter and I sort of made some overtures that may or may not have been 100% truthful. And then we were selling our little house. I watched my wife, who I think of as the most entirely decent person I've ever met. I just watched her morals bend in a way that I loved, but also it was surprising. Like all of a sudden it was like, oh, we're not going to disclose that. Oh, it's on a
You
need to
have
know
to.
basis.
Yeah.
Okay. I
Yeah.
just was like, wow, this process brings out the best and worst in us. And I'm always interested in anything that does that.
I will say it was interesting to hear you just say now about the letter because it's in the show that people are writing
Mhm.
letters and I always wondered about that. Like, does that really do anything? Like the letter can't buy me a better like if I'm selling my place because I can no longer afford it, that little nice emotional letter isn't going to help me get another place to live. So it's nice to hear it does actually work, that there are people out there that money is not the end all be all.
I mean, look, I think that when you've raised your family in a home and all your memories are there, and again, like the home sort of almost becomes a member of your family, there is so much emotional connection to this place that if you're already getting above asking,
Yeah.
but you think there's like one, family or couple that might appreciate it more, or maybe that might parallel your life inside this house more, I do think it does sway people in the end. And I it's and to be fair, again, for anybody who doesn't live in LA, like I can't express to you how crazy the
Yeah.
real estate market is here. Most houses go for way over asking, almost inexplicably. Like you'll be like, but they need to put like $200,000 into the house to
Oh
even
yeah.
make it livable. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. So if you're paying over asking and somebody else is offering over ask, it's like you're still getting more than
I
you thought you
guess.
would.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So I mean, I referenced obviously like all of these different couples. You have obviously Ray Romano and Lisa Kudrow who are selling the house, but then you have a ton of people who are coming in to try to buy it. And then you have like their family. Dennis Leary is Ray's brother who shows up and is kind of a shifty guy. Where did you start in terms of character? Like, was there a particular character that you like, this was a type that you just were itching to write that felt personal or not, that you just were like, this is where maybe I'm building something around?
I have a sort of weirdly multiple answers to that. So I told you about the musician from the Philharmonic. So
Hmm.
I knew that was something I was really interested in writing because my wife is a musician and I just feel really I just have such a reverence for for music and for people who can create music and play it beautifully. And I just love the vulnerability and the sort of like there's such a fleeting like I don't know, it's almost like it's like a flower. It's like it's blooming for a second and then it's so easily blown away by the wind. And I like I mean, I was interested in writing a character like that.
Hmm.
And at the same time that so I we moved into this house 5 days before we started shooting season 3 of Dead to Me. And again, we're still in the pandemic and I'm already thinking about, oh gosh, buying and selling a house is crazy and like high stakes and so much drive, and already just ruminating on that there's a story in there to tell. And I'm on set with Linda Cardellini, and Linda was in Dead to Me. She played a character named Judy, who is like a very sweet, walking human heart slash doormat of a person who's always about the other person, like always putting other people's feelings before her. And she was masterful at playing this part. And but also I think at this point, 5 years in, getting a little tired of playing that kind of character. And she's like, we were just, waiting for cameras to be set up at some point. And she's like, the next character I play, I just want to be a badass bitch.
Okay.
And I love her. We have a great working relationship and we've become really good friends. And I thought, like, is there somebody in this world of this LA real estate, motif who would be a badass bitch, and who would that be? So I definitely started to ruminate on who Linda might be in this world and how to make that person very different than Margot, but also feel very true to LA. And
Hmm.
I kept doing that. I kept sort of thinking like who would be in this world in LA. And I've lived here 25 years, so I have a pretty good idea of, who's in the orbit of buying and selling a house here. And, so I wanted to sort of find characters that I felt that I could write authentically.
Right.
That's always really important to me. Like, I'm a writer. I've been doing this for 30 years. Like I haven't been a contractor and I haven't been a pianist in the Philharmonic, but like I need to at least be able to like have a way in,
Hmm.
to be able to relate to the character emotionally so that I can write them in a way that feels real. And I had spent enough time with contractors at that point. So I
Yeah.
thought, well, that's really interesting. And I'm also really interested in the fact that there are many pockets of neighborhoods in LA that are really fancy and really gentrified, but still have families in it that otherwise, if they hadn't gotten in 20, 30 years ago, there's no way they could afford to live here.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just sort of trying to, find the right cast of characters to people this show that felt authentic to LA, but that didn't feel like everybody's right on the nose. Like, I didn't
Right.
want stereotypes. I wanted real people. Um, and I've always been weirdly inspired and enamored of show business. Not just show business.
Obviously.
Sorry, not just show business. Soap operas. I meant to
Oh,
say, let's cut that and let me say, I've always been weirdly enamored and inspired by soap operas.
I
My grandmother was obsessed with soap operas, and so when she would stay with us or watch us when my parents were working or away, like I would just inevitably be sitting in front of Days of Our Lives or you
I
know
was about to ask you which one, because like
Santa
you could have done an
Barbara.
episode on that.
Yep. I also dated a soap opera actress for a while, so I've just always sort of been keyed into that world, and I loved the idea of an out of work soap opera actor, who was losing his not just his relevance but his lifestyle. There's a real keeping up with the Joneses thing in LA that's just as true today as it's ever been. And so I thought, like, who would a guy like that be married to? And then it all sort of started to come together. And then, of course, Abby Jacobson and Poppy Lou play a couple who are looking for their dream home, and no surprise, they are very much, but very loosely, inspired by my wife and I.
I mean, I didn't want to assume, but I mean, I kind of did a little bit assume because you had talked so much during Dead to Me about, putting certain storylines in about having kids, and then they're going through IVF and trying
Hmm.
to have kids, um, which I thought was a really interesting and very sweet parallel, as we were talking about earlier, for like this family that's leaving the house. Like, yes, you
Hmm.
might want to have a family come in who is going to be able to raise kids the way that you raised your kids. But
Hmm.
arguably, OT and Tiona's couple, like they also are,
Tiana,
Tiana, I'm sorry, they are
no
also
problem.
in that situation. Um, how much did you play with who actually should get the house? How important was that to you?
Very important, of course. We
Well,
played with a
after all you
lot.
went through, I assumed, but
Yes, as always, and you and I have had so many conversations about sort of how these stories have unfolded season after season. I always come in with a notion of how I want to end the season because when you're pitching a show like this to Netflix, they'd like to know.
mm,
And so I had a thought of what would happen. And then you get into a room of incredibly talented writers. And I absolutely lucked out with this show in terms of the writers. I had a few of my amazing go-to writers from Dead to Me, Kara DePaulo, Kelly Hutchinson, Maddie Dollywall. But I also had I got to work with Bruce Eric Kaplan on this season, and Crystal Jenkins and Zora Beacon Gaga, um, and so you sit in a room with these writers, and you start to think like there might be another way to
mm.
do this, and it was really kind of overwhelming, and people wanted the house to have a happy ending.
More than the characters?
Certain characters, but specifically they wanted the house to go to the right
Right.
people. And we were debating who the right people were because it could have gone sort of either way. And then ultimately, we went with the original inspiration,
Mm,
which was, my wife and I. So the idea, not just that, like, that this couple, that if you really want to dig into it, like, it's important for me to show a same-sex couple with the same
yeah.
aspirations and goals and dreams as anybody else, especially now,
Yeah.
so it was nice to be able to give that couple the happy ending, but also Tiana and OT's characters, Carla and Dennis, like they get a happy ending too. And it's actually kind of in a way better because she gets to build the house and she's an architect.
Yes, they get a version of a happy ending. I want to take a little bit of umbrage with the same level of happy ending because when we see the two couples at the end, Poppy and Abby, they're on the same page. But OT
Mm-hmm.
now is keeping this big secret. And so to
Mm-hmm.
me, putting them in that house, in that like, say what you want about people who go in and sage homes and get rid of vibes and whatever. I don't do
Mm-hmm.
that. I don't necessarily believe in it, but they built on the lot that had a lot of bad juju from Luke and Linda's
Mm-hmm.
character. So to me, that's like that's like a meat for season two, which means
Mm-hmm.
that how happy can they really be if like that just feels like there's ripe territory for all the problems to come.
Yeah, it sure does.
Okay. Okay. Fine. I'm just saying, like, I looked at that ending and I was like, yeah, again, like what I said about Dead to Me, I was like, yeah, in one way, it's nice. But then when you
Mm-hmm.
really start peeling and picking at it the way that I like to pick at things, I was like, that's kind of a big secret he's keeping from her. It's kind of a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, it's also, this is to me like as happy of an ending as I would have felt comfortable doing.
Let's back it up a minute. Not
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm-hmm.
happy endings. I'm gonna just, a couple episodes ago, I was talking about something completely different, and I said, there was this one show that I watched recently, and I said I really like it, but I wish there was more murder. I can't say what it is because it's not out yet. I will say I did expect a little bit more murder in No Good Deed, and because I'm a dark person, I wanted a little bit more murder.
Wow.
I know. Well, you
Wow.
gave us so much in the last show. So that's what I was trying to walk backwards and be like, as you're, getting inspired by Linda and working with Linda on Dead to Me, and as
Mm-hmm.
you're, playing with the idea of there are some bad people here. There are some things happening. Something happened in the past. Like I said, their son gets killed. You guys should watch it to figure out what happened exactly. I'm not going to spoil that part. Um, what was the vibe for that? Like the line you wanted to how I don't want to say how happy versus how murdery, but you know, I think kind of what I mean, just in the sense of like how you determined how bad you wanted these people to be, how much murder to bring into a show like this.
Well, Danielle, I'm sorry there wasn't enough murder for you.
That's a me
I'm not,
problem.
this
That
is
is
not a
not a
show.
you problem. That is not a fault of the show.
Oh, I know. Oh, I know. I just in case we wanted to know, Danielle obviously is obsessed with murder. So
Uh-huh.
keep any sharp objects or loaded weapons away from her. But um, I this is, you know, like anything, you don't want too much because, even sugar is my favorite thing in the world, but if you have too much, it kind of ruins even the little bit that you had before. So,
You also haven't
there's a
seen me
time and a
eat,
place for
but okay.
murder, Danielle. And, you know, there is a murder in this show. And then there are other very crazy things that
Oh,
happen.
absolutely. Yeah.
But ultimately you don't want to go to the well too many times because it will start to feel predictable. And to me, that is like the death of my genre. Surprise, and
Mhm.
subversion of expectation is, I think, where this genre thrives. And so if you're expecting more murder, then that's exactly what I'm not going to give you.
Recently someone was like, name four shows that describe you, and two of my shows were Dead to Me and Dexter. So like that should tell you a lot, really. So that
Ooh.
again, not a fault of the show. It was just something that I was curious about, as especially as you're talking about, subverting certain things. Like there are certain cliffhangers where like it certainly seems like it's going to go somewhere, and then like that would be too obvious.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really do that.
Mm-mm.
Uh, yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Fair enough. So
Listen, go watch, like Law and Order. I mean, there's like, if you want to murder
that's a
every
different kind
week.
of murder.
Oh, all right.
That's not, we don't
Not
need to get
fun
into that.
murder.
It's not fun murder. Um, so I mean, I know I have to let you go, but I do want to just kind of, it's going to be kind of a broad, big question about the show, but because we're talking about all these different characters, it feels to me like a much larger ensemble than maybe I was expecting, maybe even you were expecting when you first started writing. I always like to ask like the challenges and the rewards of something like that. Did you, as
Mm-hmm.
especially as you were talking about, things take shape in the writer's room and things you think you're going to do, you have other people weigh in and you don't do. Can you kind of give an example of a character or a couple where like you thought it was going to be this, but then it became this and that was better for you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so first of all, Dead to Me is two characters, really. Yes, there were other characters in the show, but it was really a two-hander. And it was an incredible experience because I got, to work so closely with Linda and Christina doing that show, but it was also a tremendous burden on those two actors. We do 14-hour days, uh always, sometimes longer, and those two characters were in every single scene, one or
Yeah.
the other. So it just was so much to ask of two people. Not impossible, but just a lot, and so I was already interested in sort of sharing the responsibility and like spreading the work out, but I also just love working with actors. So I knew I wanted a big ensemble. What I don't think I fully realized was how difficult it would be to serve all of those characters within the time frame of 35 minutes or less.
Mhm.
And so,
Was that a self-imposed time? Because I feel like you can do different things on, like different episodes have different lengths.
there are it's not self-imposed. In order to be considered a half-hour show, your
Oh,
show
sure.
has to be under 35 minutes,
Yeah.
and then you can have one exemption that's up to 38 minutes, which we do. I think maybe the
The
finale is a little
finale. Yeah.
longer. um but if anything longer than that, it's considered an hour, and then that changes the
Yeah.
rates.
Yeah.
It becomes a union issue, and this is already a very high ticket show. It's a pricey show
Well, I mean, look
because
at
of
who you
the
cast.
right, right. And listen, like, I have incredible partners at Netflix, and they I didn't sign those checks.
Right.
Netflix made those deals, and I'm so glad that they did. And you know, what I realized as we were developing the show and as we were writing the episodes was that I had to sort of cycle in and out certain characters in order to be able to really pay off and fulfill, these stories so that they really feel like something. Because ultimately, it's a dark comedy, but it's also an emotional
Mm,
story. It's a mystery. And in order to really pay those things off, you need time. You need to be able to feel invested in these characters. So starting in episode 2, there will be one couple missing from each
right.
episode pretty much, and that really helped us with the literal real estate of telling story. So that's something that I wasn't necessarily planning on, but that we ended
Mm.
up doing. There was an alternate ending that we didn't end
Oh,
up doing that did involve another death, and we didn't end up killing that
but
person.
that was like cliffhanger for season two style.
It was a different cliffhanger for season 2, so we ended up changing the story a little bit so
Hmm.
as to not kill off a very
Right.
lovable character. And and so yeah, so there are things like that. Also, we I had this vision of showing Lisa Kudrow as Lydia, who plays the pianist for the
Mm.
Philharmonic, or the retired pianist for the Philharmonic. I kept in sort of having this visual in my head, at least, of her playing the Hollywood Bowl. So initially, the Hollywood Bowl was written into the show, and she got to
Oh,
return to her form and, come back to life as a Philharmonic pianist playing the Hollywood Bowl, but not just budget interfered on that one. Really, our writers' room was like, wouldn't it just be so much more sort of emotionally satisfying to end it this way, the way that
mm,
we did?
yeah,
And I said, as long as she can play again, that's all I really cared about.
yeah.
And I agreed that it was more emotionally satisfying the way that we did handle it. So, again, like I'm not always right about my initial story ideas. And I always say to the writers in the room, I don't need to be right for it to be good.
Mm,
I want the best idea to win. And so yeah, I mean, it was a learning process the whole time because I've never done an ensemble before.
mm.
And
Well,
they're not
not
really,
this
not as a
big.
showrunner. No,
Oh,
but not as
sure.
a
Okay.
showrunner.
Okay.
And this is big. I mean, and this is a large scale production. I mean, it was, you know, it was a big show to make. And always learning lessons, always trying to remember those lessons so I don't have to learn them again. And no doubt, as I move forward, I will continue to learn as I go. But it was a really great experience making this show. The cast truly, like, wonderful people, beyond just as talented as they are, like, just like lovely human beings.
Yeah. I mean, I have to ask season two because, like, I know you don't know, but you just were talking about like an alternate ending. And I imagine, like, okay, well, you don't choose that ending. You don't kill that character to give the opportunity for them to come back in a season two. Do you see a season two as a world where all of these people return, or is it more of like it could be anthological, where maybe some return and then there are other people that we haven't met yet? Because I do feel like some stories feel a little bit more close-ended in a happy way that I'm like, I don't want to unravel you again. I would love to watch you, but I don't want to watch you suffer sort of way.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting that you say that. First of all, one of my favorite quotes about storytelling, about television storytelling in particular. I don't want to misattribute the quote because I can't
Okay.
totally remember who it was, but it was some very smart person, and it was a guy.
Go
Weird.
figure.
And he said, "Create characters you love and torture them."
Okay.
And that is like definitely one of my mantras. And so if you feel like there are characters that you don't want to see tortured anymore, it's very likely I probably agree with you and I may not continue to torture them.
Okay.
So I will say that we did not sign all of these actors to multiple year contracts. So no, I don't think every single actor would return, Do I hope to work with some of these actors again? Of course.
You talked about the budget. I don't know what a budget in season two would be for Linda to wear all that prosthetic at the time, but I mean, there's gold in that. So I don't know what that show is. I don't know if she's on the lam or if she's in jail, but it's great.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for coming on today and for chatting about your shows and the player, of course.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Making PS 185
Oh,
proud, baby.
all right. You already know what time it is. It is time for me to tell you where to find the things that we discussed on today's episode of Made Possible by Pop Culture so that you can enjoy them just as much as Liz and I do. And as always, nobody is paying me to list these specific services. This is just an organic mention so that you have an easy time locating these things. So first up, Liz's past pop culture influence, the 1992 movie The Player, that is streaming on Max, and then Liz's shows. 3 seasons of Dead to Me streaming on Netflix, and the first season of No Good Deed just dropped on Netflix as well. Thank you, of course, to Liz for coming on to Made Possible by Pop Culture. Thank you all for listening and or watching. If you liked what you saw and or heard, tell your friends, physically hit that like button, comment, subscribe, follow on social media, and come back next week for the season finale of season 2.